Okay, here is a longer, narrative version of the story focusing on building atmosphere and suspense, designed to be shareable and potentially viral due to its lingering sense of dread. It always begins at 3:17 a.m. Not a minute sooner, not a minute later. As if bound by some unseen, meticulous clockwork, the tapping starts. 3 distinct, gentle knocks emanate from the wall behind my bed, followed by a silence so profound it feels like the world is holding its breath. Then, 3 more knocks. This precise, unnerving rhythm pries me from sleep every single time, leaving me rigid beneath the covers, heart pounding against my ribs, ears straining against the oppressive darkness of my apartment. Lately, a terrifying thought has taken root: maybe the sound isn't coming through the wall. Maybe it's closer. Maybe it's already inside my head. Moving into Apex Residences felt like winning the lottery. Years I'd spent in crumbling apartments with walls like paper and plumbing that sighed its last rites daily. Apex was different. Gleaming marble floors in the lobby, tasteful modern art, immaculate hallways bathed in soft, recessed lighting that never flickered. My unit, 1108, boasted floor-to-ceiling windows offering a breathtaking panorama of the city skyline. The realtor had proudly mentioned the building's unique acoustic design, engineered for total silence between units. Back then, that silence sounded like paradise. I settled in quickly, arranging furniture, hanging pictures, setting up my home office. The first few days were blissfully quiet. Neighbors offered polite nods in the elevator but kept to themselves. The property manager, handing over the keys, had given me a slightly strange, searching look when I confirmed Unit 1108, but I brushed it off as nothing. The tapping started on my 4th night. It was so faint I almost dismissed it as imagination. Tap. 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 A pause. Tap. 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 Annoyed but exhausted, I rolled over and eventually drifted back to sleep. The next night, it returned. Louder. More insistent. My bedside clock glowed, 3:17 a.m. The sound clearly originated from the wall adjoining Unit 1106. Odd schedule, I muttered, figuring my neighbor was a night owl or struggling with insomnia. By the 6th night, annoyance had curdled into unease. When the tapping began, I slipped out of bed, my bare feet silent on the cool hardwood floor. As I approached the living room wall, the rhythm continued, steady and patient. Tap. 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 Pause. Tap. 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 I pressed my ear against the smooth, cold paint. Instant silence. Absolute and complete. I waited, holding my breath, for several long minutes. Nothing. The moment I retreated, sinking back into the perceived safety of my bed, it started again. This time, I tried to ignore it, pulling the pillow over my head, but the sound seemed to bypass my ears, vibrating deep within my bones. The next morning, determined, I knocked on the door of 1106, mentally rehearsing a firm but friendly speech about late-night noise. No answer. I tried again that evening. Silence. Frustrated, I sought out the property manager. His expression shifted from professional courtesy to genuine puzzlement when I asked about my neighbor. Unit 1106, he repeated, frowning. That unit's been vacant for months. The last tenant, well, they left rather abruptly. Broke the lease. When I asked why, he just shrugged, offering a vague, unhelpful remark about personal reasons. A cold knot formed in my stomach. If the unit was empty, where was the tapping coming from? That night, I decided to gather evidence. I set my smartphone on the floor, angled towards the wall, recording audio. Right on schedule, at 3:17 a.m., the tapping began. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the methodical rhythm from the wall. I lay perfectly still, listening, until it finally stopped an hour later. But when I checked the recording the next morning, there was nothing. Just hours of low-level room tone, the occasional creak of the building settling, my own quiet breathing. I tried again the next night, using a different recording app, placing the phone even closer. Same result. Hours of silence. A subtle shift began in my perception of the apartment. The building's vaunted silence, once a luxury, now felt heavy, oppressive, watchful. Sounds behaved strangely. A dropped pan in the kitchen would barely register, yet whispers from the hallway sometimes echoed with unnatural clarity. The property manager's vague explanation about acoustic properties felt increasingly like a deflection. Then came the feeling of being watched. It started near the wall, that primal prickling on the back of the neck, the unnerving certainty of unseen eyes tracking my movements. Soon, the sensation permeated the entire apartment. I found myself avoiding the living room, especially after dark, retreating to the bedroom, keeping the connecting door firmly closed. It didn't help. The tapping continued, night after night, always precise, always at 3:17 a.m. Driven by a gnawing anxiety, I started digging online. Most search results for Apex residences were glossy promotional materials and real estate listings. But deep within the archives of a local news site, I found it, a brief, 3-year-old article mentioning unusual complaint patterns from residents at the newly opened Apex. It spoke vaguely of acoustic anomalies and unexplained noises, noting that several tenants had broken their leases within months of moving in. The building management, the article stated, had attributed these issues to tenants having difficulty adjusting to urban living. My sleep evaporated. Dark circles bloomed beneath my eyes. Colleagues on video calls started asking if I was feeling alright. I wasn't. The tapping wasn't just persistent, it was becoming more complex, almost conversational. Sometimes the rhythm would accelerate as I approached the wall, as if anticipating my presence with excitement. Other times, it would slow to a deliberate, methodical pace that made my skin crawl. A terrifying thought began to form: this wasn't random noise. There was intelligence behind it. A consciousness, trying to communicate in a way I couldn't comprehend. One afternoon, I shared the elevator with Mrs. Levinson from 1112. When I cautiously mentioned the strange tapping sounds, her face went pale. She asked my unit number. When I told her 1108, she jabbed her floor button repeatedly, her eyes wide with something akin to panic, until the doors slid shut between us. After that, she actively avoided me in the hallways and lobby. I tried earplugs, noise-canceling headphones, even sleeping pills. Nothing worked. The tapping seemed to bypass physical barriers, resonating directly in my skull. The pills only dragged me into a suffocating twilight state where the rhythmic knocks felt like they were coming from inside my own body. My dreams became nightmares filled with gaunt, elongated fingers rapping against glass, against bone, against the inside of my own cranium. I'd wake up gasping, drenched in cold sweat, the metallic tang of copper sharp in my mouth. One particularly harrowing night, after the tapping had gone on relentlessly for nearly 2 hours, something inside me snapped. I leaped out of bed, stormed to the wall, and pounded on it with both fists, screaming, "Stop it! Just stop! What do you want?" My outburst should have been contained by the building's soundproofing. But the next morning, the property manager called, stony-faced, to discuss noise complaints from neighboring units. When I, exasperated, mentioned the incessant tapping from the vacant apartment next door, he gave me that same strange look as before and quietly suggested that perhaps city living wasn't suitable for everyone. My obsession shifted to the wall itself. I examined every square inch, searching for cracks, hidden vents, imperfections. I pressed my ear against it at different times of day, listening for any clue. Once, just once, I thought I heard it, a faint, rhythmic sighing, like breathing. Not from the other side, but somehow from within the wall's very substance, as if the plaster and studs were inhaling and exhaling. My rational mind recoiled, screaming impossibility, but doubt had burrowed deep, cracking the foundations of my perceived reality. In my 5th week, deliverance, or perhaps damnation, came in the form of tiny scratches. While wiping down the baseboard near the wall, my cloth snagged. Looking closer, I saw them, minuscule, almost invisible marks etched into the paint. They formed words, so small and faint they could easily be mistaken for random damage. I ran my finger over the inscription, the cold dread returning full force. It read, "It wants in." Who had left this desperate warning? The previous tenant? Someone before them? I searched the rest of the apartment frantically but found nothing else. That same day, I returned to the public library, digging deeper into the building's history. Apex Residences wasn't just built near the old psychiatric facility site, it was built directly on top of it. The facility, demolished in the 1970s, had specialized in experimental treatments for severe mental disorders. Records were vague, but several patients had reportedly died during these controversial treatments. The land remained empty, scarred, for decades before the luxury condos rose from its troubled past. Returning to my apartment that evening, the air felt different. Thicker. Charged with a static I couldn't name. The area near the wall was palpably colder than the rest of the unit. When I held my hand against its surface, a tingling numbness spread up my arm, like plunging it into ice water. That night, I didn't sleep. I waited. At exactly 3:17 a.m., the tapping began. But it was different. Harder. More urgent. The pattern had changed, for rapid taps, a pause, then 4 more. Tap 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 tap. Pause. Tap 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 tap. Taking a deep breath, I switched on the lamp and walked towards the wall. For the first time, I spoke directly to the source of my torment. "What do you want?" My voice sounded thin, alien in my own ears. The tapping stopped instantly. The silence that followed was absolute, heavier than any I had experienced before, as if all sound, all vibration, had been sucked out of the world. Then, it began. Softly at first, a dry, rasping sound, steadily growing louder. Scratching. Like long fingernails dragging slowly, deliberately, against the inside of the wall. My heart hammered against my ribs. I stumbled backward. The scratching noise moved with me, horizontally along the wall, perfectly tracking my retreat. It stopped precisely in the center of the wall. A moment of unbearable silence hung in the air. Then, a single, powerful thud resonated through the apartment, shaking the pictures on the opposite wall. I didn't wait for more. I fled to the bedroom, locking the door behind me, knowing even as I did that it was a futile gesture. Whatever was on the other side, whatever it was, wasn't constrained by mere physical barriers. I spent the rest of the night huddled in the corner, eyes fixed on my own bedroom wall, waiting for the scratching to start there too. In the clear light of morning, surrounded by the mundane sounds of the waking city, my terror felt almost irrational. I examined the living room wall meticulously. No marks. No cracks. No evidence whatsoever of the night's events. Had I imagined it all? Was I suffering from some kind of breakdown, auditory hallucinations brought on by stress and lack of sleep? I knew sleep deprivation could cause paranoia, distort perception. But the visceral reality of the experiences, the cold, the pressure, the sound, made me doubt a purely psychological explanation. I saw a doctor, received a prescription for anti-anxiety medication, and a referral for therapy. I didn't tell him the whole story. Something instinctual warned me that fully disclosing the tapping, the scratching, the message, would lead down a path of interventions I wasn't ready for. The medication dulled the edges of my anxiety and helped me sleep, but it didn't stop the noises. If anything, they became more varied, more complex. Tapping and scratching were now joined by faint, sibilant whispers, too indistinct to understand, slithering just beneath the threshold of hearing. I gave up on my bedroom, taking refuge on the couch in the building's brightly lit common area, claiming insomnia when the night security guard found me there. The noises didn't follow me out of my unit, a fact that simultaneously relieved and disturbed me. They were tied specifically to 1108. To that wall. I began researching ways to break my lease, consequences be damned. My sanity felt worth any financial penalty. That's when I rediscovered the clause I'd initially overlooked. Tenant acknowledges the unique acoustic properties of the building and agrees that auditory anomalies are not grounds for lease termination. The wording struck me as chillingly deliberate, almost preemptive, as if the management knew exactly what residents might encounter. In my 7th week, I cornered Mr. Henderson, an elderly tenant who'd lived in Apex since it first opened, in the laundry room. Cautiously, I broached the subject of unusual sounds. He gave me a long, evaluating look before speaking. He confirmed the rumors about the architect's unconventional ideas about acoustic channels carrying sound in unpredictable ways. But then he leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that raised the hairs on my arms. Sometimes, he said, his eyes holding mine, I think those channels don't just connect rooms. Sometimes, I think they open up to places. Places that aren't supposed to be connected to our world at all. I forced a laugh, dismissing it as eccentricity, but his words echoed in my mind. That night, lying awake, waiting for the inevitable 3:17 a.m. appointment, I found myself contemplating his theory. What if the sounds weren't coming from next door, or even from within the wall itself, but from elsewhere? Some adjacent reality, thin as paper, pressing against the barrier between worlds. The tapping came, precise as ever. I remained perfectly still, listening not just to the sound, but between the sounds, in the pregnant pauses. And in those silences, I began to discern something new, not just noise, but a complex pattern, like information being transmitted in a code I couldn't quite decipher. Fear gave way to a strange, detached curiosity. I rose from my bed and walked slowly toward the wall. As I drew near, the tapping ceased. I placed my palm flat against the cool, smooth surface. I'm listening, I whispered, the words barely audible. For several agonizing heartbeats, nothing happened. Then, I felt it. A faint, tentative pressure against the center of my palm, as if someone on the other side had mirrored my gesture, placing their hand against mine, separated only by the plaster and studs. The pressure increased steadily. The solid wall beneath my hand seemed to shimmer, to grow thinner, more permeable. My fingertips sank slightly into the surface, which suddenly felt yielding, soft, like cool clay. A surge of pure, primal terror ripped through me. I snatched my hand back as if burned. The wall instantly appeared solid, normal, unyielding again. But in that moment, I understood with horrifying clarity. It wasn't trying to communicate. It wasn't just making noise. It was trying to get through. I write this now from a sterile hotel room across town. I fled my apartment with only what I could carry in a single suitcase, abandoning everything else. When I informed the property manager I was breaking my lease, he didn't argue, didn't even mention the substantial financial penalty. He simply nodded, a flicker of something, understanding. Pity. In his eyes. Apex isn't for everyone, was all he said. I've spent the last few days researching the previous tenants of Unit 1108. There have been 7 in the past 3 years. None stayed longer than 2 months. I managed to track down one of them, a woman now living halfway across the country. Our phone conversation was short, strained. Her voice trembled as she gave me one final, chilling warning before hanging up abruptly. Don't let it in. Whatever you do, no matter what it promises, no matter what it shows you, don't let it in. I don't know what entity resides on the other side of that wall in Unit 1108. I don't know what it truly wants, or why it fixates on the occupants of that specific space. But I know this much, some barriers exist for a reason. Some walls are meant to hold. Some spaces are not meant to connect. Last night, here in my anonymous hotel room, miles away from Apex residences, I woke suddenly. The room was silent, still. My clock read 3:17 a.m. And from the wall beside my bed, faint but unmistakable, came 3 gentle taps, a pause, then 3 more. It found me. It's still listening. And I fear, sooner or later, it will try again to get in. The Little Library on Maple Street. Eleanor Vance had lived on Maple Street for 45 years. She'd seen saplings grow into towering shade trees, watched generations of children learn to ride bikes on the sidewalk, and knew the rhythm of the neighborhood like her own heartbeat. But since her husband, Arthur, had passed away 2 years prior, the rhythm felt different. Quieter. The silence in the neat, two-story house sometimes felt vast and heavy. Arthur had been a reader, a man whose passion was bound between the covers of books. Their house wasn't just furnished with chairs and tables, it was furnished with stories. Mysteries lined the living room shelves, history filled the study, and well-loved paperbacks were stacked precariously on bedside tables. Now, they sat largely untouched, silent reminders of shared evenings and whispered plot twists. One crisp autumn afternoon, while sorting through Arthur's study, Eleanor paused, holding a worn copy of Treasure Island. Arthur had read it aloud to their son decades ago, his voice booming with pirate accents. An idea, small and uncertain at first, sparked in her mind. What if these books, filled with so much life, could find new readers, new adventures, right here on Maple Street? She remembered seeing pictures online of little free libraries, small, birdhouse-like structures where people could take a book and leave a book. It seemed like a whimsical, slightly eccentric thing to do. Would people think she was odd? Would anyone even use it? Despite her reservations, the thought of Arthur's beloved books gathering dust felt sadder than any potential awkwardness. With a newfound resolve, Eleanor enlisted the help of her teenage grandson, Mark, who was surprisingly enthusiastic about the project. They spent a weekend in the garage, measuring, sawing, and painting. Mark, tech-savvy and artistic, suggested a bright, cheerful blue with a sunny yellow roof. Eleanor carefully painted Maple Street Little Library, take a book, share a book, in neat white letters on the front. They installed it near the sidewalk at the edge of her meticulously kept garden, nestled between a rose bush and a lavender plant. Eleanor stocked it with a diverse selection from Arthur's collection, classic novels, some gripping thrillers, a few children's chapter books, and even a cookbook Arthur had surprisingly enjoyed. The first few days were quiet. Eleanor found herself peeking through the curtains more often than she cared to admit. A few neighbors slowed down as they walked past, curious looks on their faces. Mrs. Gable from across the street gave her a thumbs up during her morning jog. But the books remained untouched. Doubt crept back in. Maybe it was a silly idea. Then, one afternoon, she saw young Leo Martinez, a shy boy from down the block who rarely spoke, hesitantly approach the little library. He opened the glass door, peered inside for a long moment, and carefully selected the copy of Treasure Island. He clutched it to his chest and hurried home. Eleanor's heart swelled with a warmth she hadn't felt in months. Things changed after that. Slowly at first, then like a gentle tide turning. A copy of Pride and Prejudice disappeared, replaced by a modern romance novel. Someone left a stack of picture books. Mr. Henderson, a retired gentleman who rarely left his house, started visiting daily, rediscovering authors he hadn't read since his youth. He and Eleanor struck up conversations about their favorite reads, standing by the little blue box under the shade of the maple tree. The library became more than just a book exchange. It became a quiet point of connection. People started leaving notes inside the books they donated, little messages like, "Hope you enjoy this as much as I did," or, "This story kept me guessing until the very end." Eleanor found a small notebook tucked inside one day, labeled Maple Street Library Guest Book. It quickly filled with names, brief comments, and book recommendations. Leo Martinez became a regular visitor, his initial shyness replaced by an eagerness to discuss the adventures he was reading. He told Eleanor that Long John Silver was his favorite character, and she shared stories of Arthur reading it aloud. One rainy Tuesday, Eleanor noticed someone had tucked a small, waterproof pouch inside containing handmade bookmarks. Another time, a small pot of pansies appeared beside the library post. It wasn't just about the books anymore, it was about shared kindness, small gestures that brightened the day. The library thrived through the seasons. In winter, someone thoughtfully added a small solar light inside so people could browse after dark. In spring, colorful chalk drawings decorated the sidewalk around it. In summer, teenagers, initially aloof, started leaving graphic novels and sci-fi paperbacks, occasionally lingering to chat with Eleanor about school or summer plans. Word spread beyond Maple Street. People from neighboring blocks started making detours during their walks or bike rides. The local community newspaper even ran a small, heartwarming feature about Eleanor Vance and her little blue library that reconnected a neighborhood. One sunny Saturday afternoon, Eleanor stepped outside to find a small crowd gathered near the library. Mrs. Gable beamed, holding a small cake. Leo Martinez stood proudly beside her, holding a large, handmade card signed by dozens of people. "Eleanor," Mrs. Gable began, her voice warm, "we just wanted to say thank you. This little library, it's done more than just share books. It's brought us together. It's given us something to smile about, something to share." Mr. Henderson added, "It's reminded us of the simple pleasure of a good story, and the even greater pleasure of community." Leo shyly presented the card. Inside, amidst the signatures, were drawings of the library, quotes about reading, and heartfelt messages of appreciation. Eleanor felt tears welling up, blurring the cheerful blue paint of the little structure that had started as a way to honor Arthur's memory. Looking at the smiling faces, the children, the teenagers, her longtime neighbors, and newer residents, Eleanor realized the little library hadn't just given Arthur's books a new life, it had given her a new life, too. The quiet house didn't feel so vast anymore. It felt like the heart of something wonderful, a small beacon of connection on Maple Street, proving that sometimes, the simplest ideas, offered with an open heart, can create the most beautiful stories of all. The books continued to circulate, but the real magic was the shared humanity fostered by that little blue box under the maple tree. The melody of the forgotten courtyard. Leo arrived in the sprawling, indifferent city with 2 suitcases, a worn saxophone case, and a pervasive feeling of being utterly adrift. He'd taken a job offer that sounded promising on paper but felt isolating in reality, long hours coding in a sterile office building that scraped the clouds. His apartment, found hastily online, was small and functional, located in a tall, slightly faded building overlooking a network of anonymous back alleys. Or so he thought. One restless Saturday morning, desperate for fresh air that wasn't recycled office cool, Leo wandered down the echoing fire escape stairs instead of taking the elevator. He pushed open a heavy, rusted metal door at the bottom, expecting another grimy alley. Instead, he stepped into a place that felt like a secret exhaled by the city, a forgotten courtyard. It was large, enclosed on all 4 sides by the towering brick walls of surrounding buildings, yet open to the sky. Neglect hung heavy in the air. Weeds choked cracked flagstones, ivy clawed aggressively up the walls, and a collection of forgotten debris huddled in the corners. But beneath the decay, there was potential. Sunlight, filtered by the tall buildings, dappled the ground in shifting patterns. In the center stood the most peculiar feature, a large, multi-tiered stone structure, vaguely fountain-like but dry and silent, adorned with intricate, swirling metal shapes that looked almost like stylized musical notes or reeds. It was stained, cracked, and silent, a monument to forgotten purpose. Intrigued and needing a project, anything to distract from the loneliness, Leo returned later that day with a borrowed broom and a bin bag. He started small, clearing a patch near the entrance. It was mindless work, sweeping away years of accumulated grime and leaves, but the physical effort felt grounding. He expected anonymity, perhaps a curious glance from a window high above. Instead, after about an hour, a sharp voice startled him. "What do you think you're doing?" An elderly woman with piercing eyes and tightly pinned gray hair stood in a doorway Leo hadn't noticed before, arms crossed. This was Mrs. Petrova, a resident Leo recognized from brief, silent elevator rides. Her expression was formidable. "Just cleaning up a bit," Leo stammered, gesturing vaguely with the broom. It seemed a shame. Mrs. Petrova sniffed. A shame it's been for 50 years. Full of junk now. Used to be something, this place. Her eyes flickered towards the central structure, a fleeting softness entering them before vanishing. Don't make a mess. She retreated back inside, leaving Leo feeling slightly chastised but also more curious. Used to be something. He kept at it, dedicating an hour or two each weekend. He pulled stubborn weeds, swept pathways, and even scrubbed some of the grime off the lower tier of the central structure. Slowly, painstakingly, a small corner of the courtyard began to breathe again. One afternoon, a young boy, maybe 8 or 9, cautiously entered the courtyard, kicking a loose stone. "What cha doin'?" he asked, eyeing Leo's work. Trying to make it look nicer, Leo replied, smiling. "I'm Leo." "Matteo," the boy offered. "My grandma says this place is haunted by sad music." Leo looked at the silent stone structure. "Sad music?" "Yeah, from that thing," Matteo pointed. "She says it used to sing with the wind." Sing with the wind. The phrase caught Leo's imagination. He looked closer at the intricate metalwork, the hollow tubes, the fin-like structures. Could it be some kind of Aeolian harp or sound sculpture? Matteo started helping, mimicking Leo's weeding, his initial shyness replaced by enthusiastic chatter about school and superheroes. His presence seemed to soften the edges of the courtyard, making Leo's solitary effort feel less lonely. Their combined activity didn't go unnoticed. Other residents started peering out windows more often. One Saturday, a man from the second floor appeared with a pair of sturdy gardening gloves and wordlessly started tackling a particularly stubborn patch of ivy. Another resident offered Leo a cold drink. Small conversations sparked near the rusty gate, tentative exchanges about the weather, the state of the courtyard, and eventually, shared memories. Mrs. Petrova watched from her doorway, her expression unreadable. But one afternoon, as Leo examined the central structure, tracing the metal swirls with his finger, she emerged again. "My father helped build that," she said, her voice softer than before. "Before the war. It wasn't a fountain. It was a whispering gallery," he called it. The wind would pass through those metal reeds, it made music. Different notes depending on the strength and direction of the breeze. People used to gather here in the evenings just to listen. She sighed. Then things changed. It fell silent. Broken, I suppose. Forgotten. Her words painted a vivid picture, a stark contrast to the courtyard's current state. Leo felt a stronger sense of purpose. It wasn't just about cleaning anymore, it was about awakening something dormant. He started researching sound sculptures, wind harps, anything that might explain the mechanism. He gently cleaned the delicate metal pieces, discovering small, almost hidden apertures and finely tuned plates. The transformation of the courtyard, slow but steady, was becoming a shared project. Someone brought down potted geraniums. Another resident fixed the broken gate latch. Matteo's older sister, Maya, a budding artist, started sketching the courtyard's revival. The space, once neglected and silent, began to hum with quiet activity and tentative connection. Leo, emboldened, brought his saxophone down one evening. He sat on a cleared patch of stone and played a soft, bluesy melody. The notes seemed to hang in the enclosed space, absorbed by the old brick. Matteo listened, wide-eyed. A few windows opened above. Mrs. Petrova stood in her doorway, listening, a faint, nostalgic smile touching her lips. Inspired by Mrs. Petrova's story and his own research, Leo focused on the whispering gallery. He noticed a key piece of metal was bent, obstructing airflow into one of the main chambers. Carefully, using borrowed tools and referencing old photos Maya helped find online from city archives, he worked to gently reshape it. It took several patient attempts. Then, one breezy afternoon, as he made a final adjustment, a low, resonant hum emerged from the structure. It wasn't loud, but it was clear, a pure, ethereal note carried on the wind. Matteo gasped. Leo felt a thrill shoot through him. As the breeze shifted, a second, higher note joined the first, creating a simple, haunting harmony. Word spread through the building like wildfire. People drifted down into the courtyard, drawn by the tentative, unearthly music. Mrs. Petrova emerged, tears glistening in her eyes. "I haven't heard that sound since I was a girl," she whispered. More residents gathered, standing quietly, listening as the wind played its forgotten melody through the stone and metal. It wasn't a constant symphony, but fleeting chords, single resonant notes that rose and fell with the breeze, filling the space with a gentle, unpredictable magic. The courtyard became the building's unofficial heart. Neighbors organized a small potluck celebration. Someone strung up fairy lights. Maya displayed her sketches. Leo played his saxophone, his music intertwining with the wind song from the sculpture. People who had lived side by side for years as strangers shared stories and laughter under the open sky, connected by the revived space and its whispering melody. Leo no longer felt adrift. He had found his anchor, not just in the reclaimed courtyard, but in the community that had blossomed within its walls. He still coded in his sterile office, but now he came home to a place filled with quiet music, blooming flowers, and the warm smiles of neighbors who knew his name. The story of the forgotten courtyard and its whispering gallery became a local legend, a reminder that beauty and connection can often be found in the most overlooked places, waiting only for someone to start sweeping away the dust and listen for the melody hidden in the wind. The Whispering Dolls. Clara moved into the old apartment building, hoping the charm of its high ceilings and worn wooden floors would offset the loneliness of starting over in a new city. She needed anchors, familiar comforts. Browsing a dusty antique shop tucked away on a side street, seeking something unique to make the apartment feel like hers, she found them. They sat on a high shelf in a shadowed corner, 3 porcelain dolls. Not the cherubic, rosy-cheeked kind, but older, more severe. They were dressed in identical, faded Victorian-style dresses of deep burgundy velvet, with delicate lace collars. Their porcelain faces were smooth and pale, their painted lips fixed in faint, almost knowing smiles. But it was their eyes, large, glass orbs of a startlingly deep blue, that held Clara captive. They seemed too aware, too focused. "Quite the set, aren't they?" the elderly shop owner rasped, noticing her interest. He seemed slightly unnerved by them himself. "Found them packed away together in an old estate sale. Been sitting here a while. People admire them, but, well." He shrugged, leaving the sentence unfinished. Clara, however, felt an inexplicable pull. They were beautiful, in a haunting sort of way. They felt like history, like silent witnesses. Ignoring a faint prickle of unease, she bought all 3. "They need to stay together," she told the shop owner, a sentiment that felt oddly important. Back in her apartment, she carefully arranged them on the antique mantelpiece in her living room, spacing them evenly. They presided over the room, their glass eyes seeming to follow her movements. Initially, their presence was comforting, adding a touch of historical elegance. Clara named them in her head, Lillian, Elspeth, and Agnes, from left to right. The strangeness began subtly. It started with a feeling. The distinct, persistent sensation of being watched, even when she was alone. She'd glance up from her book or laptop, her eyes immediately drawn to the mantelpiece. The dolls sat perfectly still, their painted smiles unwavering, yet the feeling intensified whenever she looked their way. She dismissed it as nerves, the echoey quiet of the old building playing tricks on her. Then, small things seemed out of place. A book she was certain she'd left on the coffee table would be back on the bookshelf. The remote control, usually beside the sofa, would be sitting neatly on the end table near the mantelpiece. Minor things, easily attributable to her own forgetfulness in a new environment. One evening, while reading, she heard it, a faint sound, like dry leaves skittering across wood. Scritch, scratch. It seemed to come from the direction of the mantelpiece. She held her breath, listening. Silence. Probably just the old building settling, or mice in the walls, she reasoned. But the sound, brief as it was, had been sharp, distinct. A few days later, she woke abruptly in the middle of the night. The apartment was pitch black and utterly silent, except for one thing, a soft, rhythmic tapping. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the living room. Heart pounding, Clara slipped out of bed and crept towards the doorway, peering into the darkness. The tapping stopped the moment she looked. Moonlight filtering through the window illuminated the mantelpiece. Lillian, Elspeth, and Agnes sat exactly where she'd left them, their glass eyes gleaming faintly. But the air felt cold, charged with a stillness that was somehow heavier than silence. Sleep became difficult. She started having unsettling dreams, fragmented images of pale faces, dark velvet, and the chillingly vacant blue eyes watching her from shadows. She'd wake up with a gasp, the feeling of being watched clinging to her like a shroud. She tried rearranging the dolls, placing them further apart, then closer together. She even turned one slightly away, hoping to break the intensity of their collective gaze. But the next morning, she'd find them back in their original, perfect alignment, evenly spaced, facing directly forward. She knew she hadn't moved them back. The denial she'd clung to began to crumble, replaced by a creeping dread. The whispers started soon after. Faint, sibilant sounds, like wind rustling through dry paper, just on the edge of hearing. They seemed to emanate from the vicinity of the dolls, especially when Clara's back was turned. She could never make out words, just the impression of hushed, urgent conversation stopping abruptly whenever she turned around. The air around the mantelpiece grew noticeably colder, a localized chill that had no logical source. One rainy afternoon, she returned home from work, drenched and tired. As she unlocked her door, she heard it clearly from inside the apartment, a distinct, childish giggle. It wasn't malicious, but it was high-pitched, unnatural, and undeniably there. It stopped the instant the key turned in the lock. She burst into the living room, her umbrella clattering to the floor. The dolls sat serene and silent on the mantelpiece, their painted smiles fixed. But the middle doll, Elspeth, seemed different. Was its head tilted just a fraction of an inch more than before? Was that a smudge of something dark near its tiny porcelain hand? Clara felt ice snake down her spine. She couldn't ignore it anymore. She decided to research the dolls, hoping to find a logical explanation, a history that might explain the strangeness. She returned to the antique shop, but it was closed, a faded, "For Lease" sign taped to the window. Online searches for the doll's likely manufacturer yielded nothing conclusive. They were old, possibly handmade, unique. The activity escalated. Objects near the mantelpiece would be moved more dramatically, a framed photo knocked face down, a vase shifted precariously close to the edge. The whispers sometimes sounded closer, as if right behind her shoulder, and occasionally, she thought she could almost discern a word, soft and beckoning, "Stay." Or, "Play." One night, she awoke to find her bedroom door, which she always closed firmly, slightly ajar. Peering through the crack, she saw a shadow in the dimly lit living room, small, doll-sized, near the mantelpiece. It vanished the moment she blinked. She slammed the door shut and wedged a chair under the handle, spending the rest of the night huddled under her covers, listening to the faint, intermittent whispers and scritching sounds beyond the door. Clara knew she had to get rid of them. The thought filled her with both terror and a strange reluctance, as if the dolls themselves resisted the idea. Packing them felt like a betrayal, their glassy eyes following her every move. She wrapped each one carefully in bubble wrap, the silence in the room feeling heavy and judgmental. She put the wrapped dolls into a sturdy cardboard box, taping it shut with excessive amounts of tape. She decided to take them far away, not just to the building's dumpster. She drove miles out of the city to a remote woodland area, carrying the box deep into the trees. With trembling hands, she dug a shallow hole and buried the box, covering it quickly with dirt and leaves. A profound sense of relief washed over her, mingled with exhaustion. Driving back, she felt lighter than she had in weeks. The oppressive atmosphere seemed to have lifted. That night, she slept deeply, dreamlessly, for the first time since buying the dolls. The next morning, Clara walked into her living room, sunlight streaming through the windows. She made coffee, humming softly, feeling genuinely hopeful. As she turned to sit on the sofa, her eyes drifted towards the mantelpiece. And froze. Sitting there, perfectly aligned, evenly spaced, were Lillian, Elspeth, and Agnes. Their burgundy velvet dresses were immaculate, their porcelain faces pale and smooth, their fixed smiles seeming wider, almost triumphant. Their deep blue glass eyes stared directly at her. There was no dirt on them. No sign of their burial. They looked exactly as they had the day she bought them. On the polished wood of the mantelpiece, just beneath Elspeth's tiny feet, sat a single, dried brown leaf. And the air around them was very, very cold. The faint sound of whispering, like dry leaves in a perpetual autumn wind, began to fill the silent room. Clara knew, with chilling certainty, that they were home. And they would never leave again. The house that held its breath. Amelia inherited the house sight unseen. It came from a great-aunt she'd met only twice in her childhood, a stern, quiet woman named Eleanor who had lived alone for decades on the outskirts of a sleepy, fog-draped town. Seeking refuge from a chaotic city breakup and burnout, Amelia saw the bequest as a sign, a chance for peace, quiet, and a place to finally unpack, both literally and figuratively. The house, when she finally drove up the winding, tree-lined lane, was surprisingly well kept. Not modern, but meticulously preserved. Victorian architecture with steep gables and dark wood trim, surrounded by a neat, if slightly overgrown, garden. It looked solid, respectable, and blessedly isolated. The first thing she noticed upon stepping inside wasn't the antique furniture or the faint scent of lavender and old paper, but the silence. It wasn't just quiet, it was a profound, almost absorbent stillness. Sound seemed to die the moment they were made. The click of the heavy front door latch felt swallowed by the air. Her footsteps on the polished hardwood floors lacked the expected resonance. Even her own breath seemed unnaturally loud in the vacuum. Good insulation, she murmured, trying to rationalize the odd acoustics. It was an old house, perhaps it was simply built differently. She explored the rooms, finding them filled with Eleanor's belongings, books neatly shelved, porcelain figurines arranged precisely, antimacassars draped over armchair backs. Everything was orderly, undisturbed, as if awaiting Eleanor's imminent return, not gathering dust after her passing. The first few days were peaceful, if slightly unnerving. Amelia attributed her unease to the drastic change in environment. The city's constant hum was replaced by this deep, almost pressurized quiet. She tried playing music, but the melodies felt thin, struggling against the pervasive stillness. Phone calls sounded distant, the voices on the other end tinny and far away, even with perfect reception. She started noticing small inconsistencies. A dropped spoon would land with a dull thud instead of a clatter. Water running in the sink seemed muffled. Closing a cupboard door produced a soft click instead of a satisfying thump. It was as if the house itself was actively dampening sound, soaking it up like a sponge. One evening, reading in the living room, she knocked a heavy glass paperweight off the side table. She flinched, anticipating the crash. Instead, it hit the thick rug with a soft, almost apologetic puff. It was deeply unsettling. The lack of expected noise felt more jarring than a loud bang would have. The silence began to feel less like an absence and more like a presence. It felt watchful. Sometimes, particularly at night or during the dense morning fog, the stillness would intensify, becoming thick and heavy, like the air before a thunderstorm. In these moments, Amelia felt an overwhelming urge to be quiet herself, to hold her breath, lest she disturb something. The house seemed to be listening, waiting. She found a locked wooden box in the back of Eleanor's writing desk. The key was hidden, rather melodramatically, taped beneath the desk drawer. Inside wasn't jewelry or money, but a collection of small, leather-bound diaries. Amelia hesitated. Invading privacy felt wrong, but the house's oppressive atmosphere spurred her on. She needed answers. Eleanor's early entries were mundane: gardening notes, weather observations, comments on townspeople. But gradually, the tone shifted. She began writing about the house's perfect quietude, initially with appreciation. Then, the appreciation warped into something else. "The silence is deeper today," one entry read. "It requires stillness. Sudden noises are jarring. The house doesn't like them." Later entries grew more disturbed. "It holds its breath sometimes. I can feel it. Waiting. Listening. I must be careful not to startle it." And, chillingly, "The quiet keeps things in. Keeps things out. It preserves. One must respect the silence. One must become part of it." Amelia felt a cold dread creep up her spine. This wasn't just an old woman's eccentricity. Eleanor had felt it too, this living, demanding silence. The phenomena became more pronounced. Shadows in the corners of rooms seemed deeper, stretching unnaturally during the periods of intense quiet. Sometimes, when the silence felt thickest, Amelia would hear a faint, slow creak from the upper floor or a sound like a single, slow exhalation from within the walls, as if the house, having held its breath, was finally letting it out before drawing another in. She tried to fight it. One afternoon, feeling defiant, she turned her stereo up loud, blasting rock music. The sound felt wrong, distorted, fighting against an invisible pressure. Then, abruptly, the power cut out. Not just the stereo, the entire house went dark and silent. Not tripped breakers, she checked. The silence that followed was the most profound, most absolute she had yet experienced. It pressed in on her, heavy and disapproving. She felt a distinct sense of being scolded. After 10 minutes of heart-pounding stillness, the power clicked back on as silently as it had gone off. She didn't try playing loud music again. Sleep offered little escape. She dreamed of walking through rooms where sound simply ceased to exist, where her own screams were swallowed before they left her throat. She dreamed of Eleanor, her face pale and stern, putting a finger to her lips, eyes wide with warning. Amelia realized she was changing. She moved more quietly, instinctively avoiding sudden movements or loud actions. She found herself whispering, even when alone. She started arranging things with meticulous care, mirroring the undisturbed orderliness Eleanor had maintained. She was becoming part of the silence, just as the diary had suggested. One misty morning, looking out the living room window, she saw a delivery truck pull up hesitantly at the end of the lane. The driver got out, looked towards the house, then seemed to think better of it. He placed a package near the gatepost, got back in his truck, and drove away quickly, the sound of his engine seeming faint and distant almost immediately, absorbed by the property line. The house didn't like intrusions. The realization hit her with sickening clarity: she wasn't just living in the house, she was being kept by it. The silence wasn't just an acoustic quirk, it was a form of containment, a presence that demanded peace and resisted anything that might disrupt its perfect, breathless stillness. Leaving felt less like a physical impossibility and more like a violation, an act the house would somehow prevent, perhaps by simply intensifying its silent pressure until thought itself became difficult. She stopped trying to leave. She moved through the quiet rooms, her steps soft on the old wood floors. She dusted the porcelain figurines, her movements slow and deliberate. She sat for hours in the living room armchair, watching the dust motes drift lazily in the sunbeams, the silence a heavy cloak around her shoulders. Sometimes, she would stand by the window, looking out at the fog-shrouded trees, and feel the house settle around her, a deep, slow intake of breath. And Amelia would stand perfectly still, matching its rhythm, holding her own breath, waiting for the slow, quiet exhale. She was part of the house now, another preserved object in its silent collection, forever caught in the house that held its breath. The stillness between the chimes. Daniel inherited his grandfather's clockmaker shop, a narrow, dusty establishment squeezed between a modern cafe and a vacant storefront on a forgotten side street. His grandfather, Elias Thorne, had been a master craftsman, but also a recluse, content among the ticking and whirring of his intricate creations. Daniel, a musician with unsteady income, saw the shop less as a passion and more as a potential lifeline, a place to sell off the antique inventory. The shop was crammed floor to ceiling with clocks of every imaginable size and style, grandfather clocks looming like silent sentinels, ornate mantel clocks with gilded figures, cuckoo clocks frozen mid-chirp, and countless pocket watches nestled in velvet-lined trays. The air hummed with a discordant symphony of ticks, tocks, and clicks. It was overwhelming at first, a chaotic chorus of time itself. Amidst the collection, one clock stood out. It wasn't the largest or the most ornate, but it drew the eye. Housed in a dark, polished mahogany case about 4 feet tall, it had a simple, elegant face with Roman numerals and intricately carved hands. Below the face, behind a glass panel, hung 3 brass weights and a long, slow-swinging pendulum. What made it unusual was the chime. Daniel wound it tentatively, following faded instructions pasted inside the case. On the hour, it didn't produce the expected Westminster quarters or a simple dong. Instead, it emitted a sequence of 5 soft, clear, bell-like tones, a haunting, melancholic melody that seemed strangely familiar, though he couldn't place it. He decided to keep that one, placing it in the small back office where he sorted through his grandfather's ledgers. Its gentle ticking and the hourly chime became part of the shop's background noise. The first oddity occurred about a week later. Daniel was pricing a batch of pocket watches when the clock chimed the hour, 3 p.m. The 5 familiar tones echoed softly. But moments later, before the minute hand had visibly moved, he heard it again, fainter this time, almost like an echo, but perfectly distinct, the same 5-note melody. He frowned, assuming it was an acoustic trick of the old building, the sound bouncing off the cluttered shelves. A few days later, while eating a sandwich at the cluttered desk, he glanced up as the clock began its hourly chime for 1 p.m. He listened to the 5 notes. Then, silence. He focused on his sandwich. A minute or 2 passed. Suddenly, from the main shop area, he heard the exact same 5-note chime, just as loud as the original. He froze, sandwich halfway to his mouth. He walked quickly into the main shop, peering at the dozens of clocks. None of them had a chime remotely similar. They ticked and talked, oblivious. He returned to the office, staring at the mahogany clock. It swung its pendulum rhythmically, innocently. Weird, he muttered, attributing it to the cacophony playing tricks on his ears. But the echoes started happening more frequently, and stranger. Sometimes the mimic chime would sound immediately after the real one, sometimes minutes later. Sometimes it sounded fainter, sometimes just as loud. And occasionally, it seemed to come from a different direction, not the main shop, but perhaps the dusty storeroom, or even, impossibly, from the street outside. He started paying closer attention to the clock itself. The craftsmanship was impeccable, the movement intricate. He found his grandfather's notes about it, detailing its complex mechanism, but nothing about a secondary chime or an echo effect. Elias had simply labeled it, the Nocturne Clock, a name that felt both poetic and slightly ominous. One evening, working late, Daniel was startled by the 9 p.m. chime. He listened intently. The 5 notes played. Silence descended, thick with the ticking of other clocks. He held his breath. Then, from directly behind him, seemingly inches from his ear, came the 5-note melody again, perfectly replicated, but with an airy, almost breathless quality. He spun around, heart hammering. The office was empty except for him and the clock standing against the far wall. The air felt cold. Sleep became difficult. The gentle ticking of the nocturne clock, once soothing, now felt like a countdown. The memory of the chime whispered right behind him lingered. He started to dread the top of the hour. He noticed other subtle changes. Sometimes, the ticking of the nocturne clock seemed to falter just before the mimic chime sounded elsewhere in the shop, as if it were pausing, listening. He tried recording the phenomenon on his phone, hoping to capture the echo. When he played it back, he heard the initial chime clearly. But where the mimic chime should have been, there was only static, a strange hissing sound that made the hairs on his neck stand up. Daniel found more of Elias's journals, tucked away in a hidden drawer. These weren't technical notes, they were personal. His grandfather wrote about the nocturne clock with a mixture of pride and apprehension. "It keeps perfect time," one entry read. "But it learns. It listens." Another entry, years later, was more frantic. "The stillness between the chimes is growing longer. It waits. It's practicing. Mimicking more than just the notes now." The final relevant entry was short, the handwriting shaky. "It needs silence to perfect the echo. Don't let the others stop. Don't let the others stop." Daniel looked around the shop, at the dozens of ticking, whirring clocks his grandfather had kept running meticulously. Was their constant noise a form of protection? A way to drown out or confuse the mimicry? Driven by a growing dread, Daniel decided to test the theory. One afternoon, he systematically went around the shop and stopped every single clock, silencing the comforting cacophony. The sudden, profound quiet was shocking, broken only by the steady, isolated tick-tock of the nocturne clock in the back office. The silence felt heavy, expectant. He sat at his desk, waiting for the hour to strike. The ticking of the nocturne clock seemed impossibly loud in the stillness. As the minute hand clicked towards the 12, he held his breath. The clock began its chime, the 5 haunting notes filled the oppressive silence. They faded. Then came the mimicry. It didn't come from one place, but from everywhere at once. The 5-note melody echoed from the main shop, the storeroom, the street outside, even seemingly from within the walls. It wasn't just an echo, it was a chorus, perfectly harmonized, surrounding him. But layered beneath the bell-like tones was something else, a faint, discordant sound, like whispers or shuffling fabric, woven into the melody. And then came the final note. Instead of fading cleanly, it held, resonating, and subtly changed pitch, morphing into a low, drawn-out hum. Accompanying the hum, Daniel heard a soft, rhythmic tapping sound begin on the other side of the office door. Tap, tap, tap. Slow, deliberate. Terror seized him. He scrambled backwards, knocking over his chair. The humming continued, a vibrational thrum that seemed to sink into his bones. The tapping persisted, patient, rhythmic. He stared at the door, expecting the knob to turn. He remembered his grandfather's last warning, "Don't let the others stop." With trembling hands, Daniel lunged towards the nearest grandfather clock he had silenced, fumbling with its pendulum. He set it swinging. Tick. Tock. He rushed to another, winding it hastily, its spring groaning in protest. Whir. Click. He ran around the shop, frantically restarting clock after clock. As the familiar cacophony of ticking and whirring gradually returned, flooding the silence, the pervasive humming began to fade. The tapping on the office door slowed, then stopped. The multi-directional mimic chime ceased. By the time Daniel had restarted half the clocks in the shop, the oppressive atmosphere had lessened, though his heart still pounded. He cautiously opened the office door. The hallway outside was empty. He looked back at the nocturne clock. It ticked rhythmically, its pendulum swinging serenely, as if nothing had happened. Daniel never stopped the other clocks again. He kept them wound, their discordant symphony a necessary shield. He learned to live with the nocturne clock and its phantom echoes, though he never got used to the faint mimic chimes sounding from unexpected corners of the shop. He never knew exactly what he had heard during those terrifying minutes of silence, what presence the clock's mimicry had almost perfectly replicated, or what waited in the stillness between the chimes. He only knew that the constant ticking of 100 clocks was the price of keeping it at bay. The shop remained open, a haven of intricate timepieces, guarded by a wall of sound against a silence that listened, learned, and waited. The town where yesterday lingered. Finn needed a change of scenery, somewhere quiet to finish his thesis on historical preservation. The remote town of Oakhaven seemed perfect, nestled in a valley, bypassed by major highways. It looked like a postcard from 50 years ago. Its listing boasted preserved architecture and a tight-knit community, ideal for focusing and perhaps interviewing locals about the town's history. He rented a small, furnished cottage on the edge of town. It was quaint, clean, and filled with slightly dated furniture. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke and damp earth. His landlady, Mrs. Gable, a pleasant woman with kind eyes but a perpetually worried expression, welcomed him warmly but vaguely. "We like things settled here, Mr. Hayes," she'd said, handing him the keys. Change comes slow in Oakhaven. The town itself was eerily picturesque. Immaculate clapboard houses, a town square with a gazebo, a general store with a bell above the door. But as Finn settled in, he noticed peculiarities beyond mere old-fashioned charm. It started with conversations. He'd chat with the shopkeeper, Mr. Abernathy, about the weather. The next day, Finn might mention the previous day's rain, and Mr. Abernathy would look confused. "Rain?" "No, sun, it was sunny all day yesterday." Clear as a bell. Finn would dismiss it, maybe he was misremembering. He tried interviewing older residents about the town's founding for his thesis. He spoke to Mrs. Gable one afternoon about the old mill by the river. She shared vivid memories of playing there as a child, describing specific details, a broken water wheel, a willow tree leaning over the bank. The next day, Finn walked down to the mill. The water wheel was intact, spinning slowly. There was no willow tree, only sturdy oaks. When he gently mentioned the discrepancy to Mrs. Gable later, she frowned, her brow furrowed in genuine confusion. "Willow tree? No, dear, it's always been oaks down there. My memory must be playing tricks." This pattern repeated with unsettling frequency. Details shifted. Shared experiences seemed to evaporate overnight. People would confidently assert facts about the previous day that directly contradicted what Finn had observed or discussed with them. It wasn't just forgetfulness, it was a collective, confident misremembering of the immediate past. Everyone seemed perfectly aligned in their version of yesterday, a version that often subtly differed from Finn's own recollection. He started keeping meticulous notes. Dates, times, conversations, weather patterns, small details he observed around town. Each morning, he'd review the previous day's notes and compare them with the town's apparent reality. Discrepancies piled up. A blue car parked outside the bakery yesterday was recalled by everyone as red. A town meeting discussed on Tuesday was universally remembered on Wednesday as having happened the week before. A crack in the pavement he'd noted stepping over vanished overnight. The most disturbing aspect was the townspeople's complete lack of awareness or concern. They seemed perfectly comfortable, their shared, slightly incorrect version of yesterday forming a seamless reality for them. When Finn tried to point out inconsistencies, using his notes as evidence, they'd smile patiently, perhaps pat his arm. "You've been working too hard, Mr. Hayes," they'd say kindly. "Maybe take a walk, clear your head. Yesterday was just like we remember it." They weren't gaslighting him, they genuinely believed their version. His memory was the outlier. The feeling of isolation grew immense. Was he losing his mind? Was the stress of the thesis causing him to hallucinate or misremember? He clung to his notes, his objective record, as proof of his sanity. He noticed the town seemed static. Despite the shifting details of the immediate past, the broader picture remained unchanged. No new businesses opened, no houses were renovated beyond basic upkeep, fashions remained subtly dated. It felt preserved, not just architecturally, but temporally, stuck in a loop where only the texture of the most recent yesterday was malleable. One evening, driven by unease, Finn explored the town archives located in the small, dusty library basement. He found old newspapers, photographs, town records. He noticed something odd in photos from decades ago: the faces. While hairstyles and clothing changed, some faces looked strikingly, impossibly familiar. A man resembling Mr. Abernathy, but younger, stood behind the counter in a photo from the 1960s. A girl remarkably like Mrs. Gable smiled from a school picnic picture dated 1958. It wasn't just family resemblance, it was them, barely aged across decades. A chilling thought occurred to him: what if the town didn't just misremember yesterday? What if it actively rewrote it, smoothing over inconsistencies, preserving a specific state, keeping things settled, as Mrs. Gable had said? And what if this process affected not just memories, but physical reality and even time's effect on the inhabitants themselves? He started paying attention to how things were fixed. One day, the gazebo in the town square had peeling paint on one railing. The next morning, it was pristine, the paint perfect, yet no one recalled seeing anyone paint it. "It's always looked fine, Mr. Hayes," was the standard reply. Small damages, minor deviations from the norm, seemed to correct themselves overnight, absorbed into the town's preferred version of yesterday. Finn realized the danger. If the town unconsciously smoothed over the past each night, what happened to things, or people, who didn't fit? Would he eventually be smoothed over? Would his memories be rewritten? Would he wake up one morning perfectly content, remembering a yesterday that aligned with everyone else's, his thesis forgotten, his past life a vague dream? He had to leave. The thought sparked a primal fear. He packed his bags hastily one afternoon, his hands trembling. He didn't tell anyone. He walked to his car, parked on the street near his cottage. He fumbled with his keys, his heart pounding. Mr. Abernathy walked past, tipping his hat. "Leaving us so soon, Mr. Hayes?" he asked amiably. "Just heading out for a bit," Finn mumbled, avoiding his eyes. "All right then. Have a pleasant day." Before, Mr. Abernathy said, his wording slightly odd but delivered with a normal smile. He continued down the street. Finn finally got the car door open and slid inside. He started the engine. As he pulled away from the curb, he glanced in the rearview mirror. Oakhaven looked peaceful, bathed in the late afternoon sun, unchanging. Mrs. Gable was watering flowers in her garden, humming softly. He drove faster than he should have on the winding roads leading out of the valley. He didn't stop until he was miles away, pulling over at a generic highway gas station, the fluorescent lights and noise a jarring contrast to Oakhaven's quietude. He felt breathless, shaky. He stayed the night at a motel. The next morning, he cautiously checked his notes from his last day in Oakhaven. Everything seemed consistent with his memory. He called a friend from the city. The conversation felt normal, grounded in shared, stable reality. Relief washed over him, immense and profound. Weeks later, back in the city, trying to piece his thesis together from his notes and the unsettling experience, he found a local news article online mentioning Oakhaven. It described the town as a perfectly preserved gem known for its timeless quality and long-lived residents. Appended to the article was a recent photograph of the town square. Finn zoomed in. Standing near the gazebo, smiling faintly at the camera, were Mr. Abernathy and Mrs. Gable. They looked exactly the same as when he'd left. Beside them stood a young man with dark hair, holding a notebook, looking slightly confused but smiling politely. Finn didn't recognize him. But he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the newcomer wouldn't remember being in that photograph tomorrow. Oakhaven continued its quiet existence, forever smoothing out the edges of yesterday, preserving its timeless state, waiting for the next visitor to absorb into its gentle, horrifying stillness. The flicker in the photographs. Liam wasn't a photographer, not really. He just liked capturing moments, the way sunlight hit the old brick of his apartment building, the fleeting expressions on strangers' faces in the park, the comfortable clutter of his own life. He used an old, second-hand digital camera, nothing fancy, uploading the photos to his laptop mostly for his own viewing. He lived alone in a city that often felt too big and too fast. His photos were anchors, small proofs of his existence, moments captured against the relentless forward rush. He had few close friends nearby and a job that involved staring at spreadsheets, so his camera became his companion on quiet weekends and lonely evenings. The issue began subtly, almost imperceptibly, within the photos themselves. He first noticed it in a picture he'd taken of his own sparsely furnished living room. He'd been trying to capture the warm glow of his reading lamp against the twilight deepening outside the window. Looking at it later on his laptop, he zoomed in on a framed print hanging on the wall, a simple landscape he'd owned for years. In the digital photo, for a split second as the image rendered, the landscape in the frame seemed to flicker, replaced by an image of a completely different room, unfamiliar furniture, different wallpaper, bathed in a cold, blue light. Before he could properly register it, the image snapped back to the familiar landscape. Liam blinked, rubbing his eyes. A screen glitch? A temporary loading error? He closed the photo and reopened it. The landscape print remained perfectly normal. He shrugged it off, attributing it to tired eyes or a faulty display driver. A few days later, he took some photos in a nearby park. One shot captured an elderly couple sitting on a bench, sharing a quiet moment. When reviewing the pictures, he zoomed in on the couple. Again, that momentary flicker. This time, the couple on the bench were replaced, for less than a heartbeat, by two entirely different figures, younger, dressed in slightly outdated clothing, their faces turned away. Then, snap, the original elderly couple reappeared, serene and unchanged. A prickle of unease ran down Liam's spine. This wasn't just a random glitch. It was specific, targeted within the photos themselves, replacing elements with something else. Something unfamiliar. He started going through his older photos, hundreds of them stored on his hard drive. He looked closely, zooming in on details, reflections in windows, faces in crowds, objects in the background. He began to find more flickers. A reflection in a shop window momentarily showed a street he didn't recognize. A face in a blurry crowd shot flickered into someone else entirely before resolving back. A book on his own nightstand briefly appeared as a different title, a different cover design. These phantom images were always fleeting, lasting only a fraction of a second as the photo loaded or when zooming. They were like subliminal messages, ghosts in the machine, visible only if you were looking closely at the precise moment of transition. Trying to screenshot them was impossible, the flicker was faster than his reflexes. The flickers began to have a common aesthetic. The replacement images, the phantom moments, often showed scenes or people that felt slightly older, perhaps from a few decades past. The lighting in these phantom images was often colder, bluer, than in his original photos. And crucially, Liam himself was never visible in any reflection or background shot that flickered. If his own image should have been there, the flicker showed only an empty space or an unfamiliar figure turned away. He became obsessed, spending hours scrutinizing his photos, searching for the flickers, trying to understand the pattern. Was his camera haunted? Was his laptop compromised? He ran virus scans, checked camera settings, even tried viewing the photos on a different device. The flickers persisted, tied intrinsically to the digital files themselves. The truly terrifying phase began when the flickers started targeting photos of him. He rarely took selfies, but he had a few pictures friends had taken, or shots captured accidentally in mirrors. In a photo taken at a friend's party months ago, his smiling face, for that split second, flickered into the face of a stranger, a man with sharp features and cold eyes, looking directly out of the photo with unsettling intensity. Snap! Liam's own smiling face returned. He felt a wave of nausea. In another photo, a reflection of him caught in a darkened windowpane, the flickering replacement wasn't another person, but simply, nothing. An empty space where his reflection should have been, the room behind him visible through the void. It was as if, for that instant, he didn't exist in that recorded moment. Sleep became difficult. He felt a growing sense of derealization. If his captured moments, his proof of existence, were being subtly overwritten or erased within the photos, what did that mean for his actual place in the world? Was he being replaced? Edited out? He stopped taking new photos. The act felt dangerous now, like opening a door to allow these phantom moments further in. He even avoided looking too closely at his old pictures, terrified of what new flicker he might discover. But the feeling of being overwritten lingered. He started noticing strange things in his apartment, beyond the photos. Sometimes, for just a second, he'd catch a glimpse of movement in his peripheral vision, a shadow shifting where none should be. He'd occasionally find objects slightly misplaced, not dramatically, but just enough to make him question his own memory, keys not quite where he thought he left them, a book angled differently on the shelf. Were these real, or was his paranoia, fueled by the photos, bleeding into reality? One rainy evening, he was making tea in his small kitchen. He glanced at the polished surface of the microwave door, catching his own reflection. For a terrifying instant, the reflection flickered. Instead of his own tired face, he saw the sharp-featured man with the cold eyes staring back at him from the microwave surface. It lasted barely a second before his own reflection solidified again, looking pale and horrified. He stumbled back, dropping the mug, which shattered on the floor. This wasn't just in the photos anymore. It was happening in real-time reflections. He felt an overwhelming urge to destroy the source, the photos, the digital files that seemed to house this creeping erasure. He grabbed his laptop, his hands shaking. He didn't just delete the photo folder, he initiated a full factory reset, wiping the hard drive completely. He then took the old digital camera, walked outside to the communal bins behind his building, and threw it in, burying it under bags of rubbish. He returned to his apartment, breathing heavily, feeling a desperate hope that cutting off the source would stop the phenomenon. He avoided looking at reflective surfaces. He sat in the dim light of his living room, the silence broken only by his own ragged breathing and the rain outside. Hours passed. The feeling of immediate dread lessened slightly, replaced by a bone-deep weariness. Maybe it was over. Maybe it had just been the camera, the files, some bizarre digital contagion. Exhausted, he eventually drifted off to sleep in his armchair. He woke sometime later, unsure how much time had passed. The rain had stopped. The room was dark. He sat up, disoriented. He glanced towards the wall where his framed landscape print hung. In the faint ambient light filtering in from the street, it looked different. He fumbled for the lamp switch beside his chair. As the warm light filled the room, he stared at the print. It wasn't the familiar landscape anymore. It showed the interior of a room he didn't recognize, unfamiliar furniture, different wallpaper, bathed in a cold, blue light. The phantom image from the flickering photo was now permanently displayed in the frame. With trembling hands, Liam reached for his phone on the side table to use its flashlight, needing to see more clearly. He fumbled, knocking it to the floor. He bent down to pick it up. As he retrieved it, the phone's screensaver illuminated, a default, generic image of mountains he'd never set. His chosen background, a photo of the city skyline he'd taken months ago, was gone. He slowly stood up, phone in hand, a cold dread washing over him. He looked around his living room. Small things were wrong. The pattern on the armchair felt unfamiliar under his hand. A stack of books on the coffee table included titles he didn't own. The air felt colder, the silence deeper. He backed towards the hallway mirror, compelled by a horrifying need to know. He raised his eyes to meet his reflection. Staring back at him from the mirror was the man with the sharp features and the cold, unsettling eyes. He offered Liam a slow, faint smile. It wasn't a flicker this time. It was steady. It was real. And Liam, standing in the subtly altered room, realizing his photos hadn't just been recording moments but templates for replacement, understood that the final deletion wasn't on a hard drive. It was happening now. He opened his mouth to scream, but only a faint, unfamiliar whisper escaped into the cold, quiet air of the room that was no longer his. The wallpaper room. Seeking quiet inspiration and affordable rent, Maya, a freelance textile designer, took a room in the old Blackwood boarding house. It stood on a hill overlooking the town, a rambling Victorian structure with more gables than seemed necessary, paint peeling like sunburned skin. Mrs. Petrov, the landlady, a woman whose age was as indeterminate as the building's structural integrity, rented rooms mostly to long-term, eccentric tenants who preferred solitude. Maya's room was large, attic-like, with slanted ceilings and a single dormer window. Its most striking feature was the wallpaper. It covered every wall, a dense, complex pattern of swirling florals interwoven with intricate geometric shapes in faded shades of teal, ochre, and deep crimson. It was the kind of pattern that felt simultaneously beautiful and dizzying, pulling the eye in endless loops. Original, Mrs. Petrov had stated flatly, as if daring Maya to complain. Maya found it oddly compelling, a vintage charm. The first week was productive. Maya set up her drawing table by the window, sketching designs, enjoying the quiet seclusion. The wallpaper became background noise, its busy pattern fading into the periphery. Then, she started to notice inconsistencies. It began with a feeling of being watched, a common enough sensation in an old, creaky house. But this feeling was localized to the walls. When she worked at her desk, she felt eyes on her back. When she lay in bed, the wall facing her seemed attentive. She dismissed it as imagination, the effect of the complex pattern playing tricks on her perception. One afternoon, while studying a section of the wallpaper near her bed, she noticed a floral motif, a stylized crimson bloom, that seemed slightly different from the identical blooms repeating across the wall. Its petals curled inward just a fraction more, the shading darker. Strange. She scanned the rest of the wall. All the other crimson blooms were identical to each other, but different from this one anomaly. Manufacturing defect, she murmured, though it seemed odd for just one flower in the entire room to be flawed. A few days later, she was sketching a new design featuring a peculiar spiral shape. Later that evening, tidying her desk, her gaze fell upon the wallpaper directly behind where she'd been working. Within the intricate geometric lattice, she saw it, a shape almost identical to the spiral she had sketched, rendered subtly in the faded teal lines. It wasn't prominent, easily missed if you weren't looking, but it was undeniably her spiral. Coincidence? Pareidolia? Her mind projecting her work onto the busy background? It had to be. But the coincidences mounted. A small, crescent moon shape she doodled absent-mindedly in her notebook seemed to appear woven into the floral vines near the window the next day. The specific jagged edge of a broken teacup she'd sadly thrown out was suddenly mirrored in the ochre geometry by the door. It was never obvious, always subtle, seamlessly integrated, as if it had always been there. Yet Maya knew it hadn't. She started to feel like the wallpaper was learning her. Observing her life, her work, her small habits, and incorporating them into its design. The idea was absurd, yet the evidence accumulated. She tried covering a section of the wall behind her desk with a large blank sheet of paper, hoping to block its view. The feeling of being watched intensified from that spot, becoming almost physically palpable, a pressure against the back of her neck. She took the paper down after an hour, unnerved. Sleep grew difficult. She'd lie awake, staring at the swirling patterns in the dim moonlight, feeling them shift and writhe just outside her direct line of sight. She imagined the tiny lines rearranging themselves, the faded colors bleeding into new forms while she slept. She started leaving the hallway light on, hoping to keep the walls static, observed. One rainy Saturday, confined to her room, she decided to examine the wallpaper systematically. Armed with a sketchbook and pencil, she started mapping a large section near the door, tracing the intricate repeats. She noticed faint, almost invisible indentations in the paper near certain motifs, like someone had pressed hard with a pencil point long ago. And in one corner, tucked behind a loose flap near the baseboard, she found tiny, spidery handwriting. It sees. It copies. Don't let it finish. The ink was ancient, faded almost to nothing. A cold dread washed over Maya. Someone else had noticed. Someone else had been trapped in this room, watched by the walls. Don't let it finish. Finish what? That night, the feeling of observation was unbearable. The air in the room felt thick, charged. Maya couldn't shake the image of the hidden warning. She tried to read, but her eyes kept darting to the walls, searching for new, unsettlingly familiar shapes. Had the crimson flower near her bed curled even further inward? Did that geometric pattern now echo the shape of the key to her room? She must have drifted off, exhausted, because she woke suddenly in the dead of night. The room was utterly silent, pitch black beyond the thin moonlight filtering through the window. But she wasn't alone. The feeling of being watched was intense, suffocating. It emanated from the wall directly opposite her bed. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She didn't want to look, but she couldn't stop herself. Slowly, trembling, she reached out and clicked on the bedside lamp. The light flooded the room, harsh and revealing. She forced her eyes towards the opposite wall. The wallpaper there had changed. Not subtly this time. The swirling florals and geometric shapes had rearranged themselves, shifted and flowed into a new configuration. Woven into the very fabric of the pattern, rendered in the familiar faded teal, ochre, and crimson, was a detailed, unmistakable image. It was Maya. It was her, lying in the bed, asleep, turned on her side, facing the wall. The curve of her shoulder, the spread of her hair on the pillow, the precise angle of her head, it was undeniably, perfectly her. It wasn't a painting on the wallpaper, it was the wallpaper. Her sleeping form had become part of the permanent design. A silent scream built in her throat. The room, the house, felt like it was closing in. The wallpaper wasn't just observing and copying, it was absorbing. Incorporating. Finishing. Maya scrambled out of bed, stumbling backwards, her eyes fixed on the horrifying portrait embedded in the wall. She didn't grab her keys, her phone, or her wallet. She didn't pause to put on shoes. She flung open her door and fled. She raced down the dark, creaking stairs of the Blackwood boarding house, the sound of her own frantic footsteps unnaturally loud in the sleeping building. She didn't stop running until she was blocks away, standing breathless under a streetlight in the cold night air, the image of herself trapped in the wallpaper burned into her mind. She never went back for her belongings. She left town the next day, haunted by the memory of the room that watched and learned. Sometimes, in the quiet moments, she'd catch sight of a complex pattern, on fabric, in tiles, in the grain of wood, and feel a jolt of primal fear, imagining familiar shapes beginning to form within it. She knew the wallpaper room in the old boarding house was still there, its pattern subtly altered, now holding a permanent, faded portrait, patiently waiting for its next occupant to observe, to copy, and perhaps, this time, to finish. The mimic in the static. Ben inherited his grandfather's remote cabin, a place he hadn't visited since he was a child. Nestled deep in woods miles from the nearest town, it was rustic, quiet, and perpetually smelled of damp wood and wood smoke. He decided to spend a few weeks there, hoping the isolation would help him finish his overdue manuscript. Cell service was non-existent, and the only connection to the outside world was an old, heavy Bakelite radio sitting on a dusty shelf, a relic from his grandfather's time. The first few days were blissfully silent, broken only by the wind in the pines, the scuttling of unseen creatures in the undergrowth, and the crackle of the fire in the hearth. He worked well, the quiet fueling his concentration. Out of curiosity one evening, he plugged in the old radio. After a moment of warming up, the tubes glowed faintly, and the speaker emitted a low, persistent hiss of static. He twisted the dial slowly, catching only faint snippets of distant music or talk shows dissolving back into the ubiquitous static, the kind of white noise that could be almost soothing. He left it on, a low hum against the profound silence of the woods. The strangeness began subtly, easily dismissed. Sometimes, within the constant shh of the static, Ben thought he heard patterns, faint rhythms or shifts in pitch that sounded almost deliberate. Other times, it seemed like sounds from outside, a branch tapping the window, the hoot of an owl, or briefly, faintly echoed within the static, distorted and muffled, before vanishing back into the noise. He chalked it up to atmospheric interference, the remote location, or an aging radio playing tricks. One afternoon, while pacing the main room and thinking through a plot point, Ben let out a short, frustrated cough. A few seconds later, from the radio speaker, came a sound buried deep within the static, kh. A dry, papery imitation of his cough. It was slightly off, lacking resonance, but unmistakable. He stopped pacing, staring at the radio. Coincidence? An odd burst of static? He coughed again, deliberately this time. Silence from the radio, just the steady hiss. He felt foolish, unnerved for no reason. But it happened again. A floorboard creaked under his weight. Moments later, a similar, slightly delayed creak seemed to emerge from the radio static. He dropped a log onto the hearth with a thump, a soft, static-filled THMP followed from the speaker. The radio seemed to be listening. And mimicking. Always slightly delayed, always slightly distorted, like a poor recording played through cotton wool. He tried unplugging it. The static, predictably, stopped. The silence of the cabin felt immense, almost watchful. But the quiet didn't bring relief. He kept imagining sounds, phantom creaks and whispers. After an hour, feeling unnerved by the absolute silence, he plugged the radio back in. The familiar static felt, bizarrely, like a lesser evil. Then, it started mimicking his voice. He'd been reading aloud from his manuscript, testing the flow of a sentence. The chilling wind swept through the broken panes. He read. A minute later, filtered through the static, came a faint, desiccated whisper, "Ch chilling wind, br broken panes." It wasn't his voice exactly, but a thin, dry imitation, devoid of inflection, like an insect trying to speak. Ben felt ice crawl up his spine. He slammed his manuscript shut. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice trembling slightly. The radio hissed. Then, the whisper came again, closer sounding this time, clearer through the static, "Who's there?" It used the exact cadence of his question, but the voice was utterly alien, a fractured echo. From then on, the mimicry became more frequent, more targeted. If he hummed, a distorted version of the tune would surface moments later. If he swore under his breath after deleting a paragraph, the curse would be whispered back at him. It started piecing together fragments of things he'd said earlier in the day, creating nonsensical or disturbing sentences whispered through the static. Cold, finish manuscript, alone here. He tried talking to it, reasoning with it, demanding it stop. The radio only captured his words and flung them back, twisted and wrong. It laughed once, he'd let out a nervous chuckle, and the radio responded with a dry, rattling ha-ha-ha that sounded utterly devoid of humor. It felt intelligent. It felt malevolent. He couldn't work. He couldn't relax. Every sound he made felt like feeding ammunition to the thing in the radio. He started moving silently, deliberately making as little noise as possible. The silence in the cabin grew thick again, but now it was punctuated by the constant, waiting hiss from the speaker. He noticed the mimicry wasn't always coming from the radio anymore. Sometimes, the static whisper seemed to emanate from a dark corner of the room, or from the hallway leading to the bedroom. The sound was becoming untethered from its source. Was the radio just an antenna, a focal point for something already in the cabin, or in the woods? Something drawn to his presence, learning him through sound. One night, unable to sleep, he sat staring at the radio's faintly glowing dial. The static seemed louder, more agitated. Then, a new sound emerged. It wasn't mimicking him this time. It was a voice he vaguely recognized, his grandfather's voice, thin and distant, like a recording from an old answering machine. "Shouldn't have come back, Benny." It whispered through the static. It learns, it gets in the quiet. Ben felt a primal terror grip him. Had his grandfather experienced this? Was that why he lived like a hermit? Was this thing trapped in the radio, or was the radio just its mouthpiece? He had to destroy it. He grabbed the heavy iron poker from the fireplace. He approached the radio, heart pounding. The static intensified, swirling, almost seeming to watch him. "Get out!" Ben yelled, raising the poker. From the radio, and seemingly from the corners of the room simultaneously, came his own voice, loud and clear, but utterly flat, layered with static. "Get out!" Then, a chorus of whispers erupted, mimicking every word he'd spoken since he arrived, overlapping, distorted, nonsensical, a cacophony of his own voice turned against him. He brought the poker down hard. The Bakelite case shattered, tubes crunched, wires sparked. The radio fell silent. For a moment, blessed silence filled the cabin. Ben stood panting, the poker still raised. He'd done it. It was over. Then, from the wreckage of the radio on the floor, a faint sound began. A low hiss. It grew louder, steadier. The familiar static. But it wasn't coming from the broken speaker anymore. It seemed to emanate from the air itself, from the walls, from the very silence of the cabin. And then, a whisper, right beside his ear, perfectly mimicking his own voice, laced with dry static, "Alone here." Ben dropped the poker. He backed away slowly, eyes wide with horror. He hadn't destroyed it. He had only broken its cage. The mimic was loose, untethered, and it had learned his voice perfectly. The static filled the cabin, no longer white noise, but the sound of something ancient, patient, and hungry, waiting in the quiet spaces, ready to whisper back his deepest fears in his own voice. He was miles from anywhere, utterly alone, with a silent mimic that now filled the air around him. The faces in the feed. Chloe lived much of her life through the warm glow of her phone screen. Not out of vanity, but necessity. She worked remotely, lived alone in a bustling city where anonymity felt like the default setting, and found solace and connection in the curated squares and fleeting stories of Moments, the ubiquitous social media app. It was where birthdays were celebrated, news was shared, and life, both mundane and momentous, was documented. She scrolled idly one evening, flipping through photos from her friend Liam's weekend hike. Beautiful shots of mountains and forests. Then, she stopped on a group photo Liam had tagged her in from a party weeks ago. She smiled, remembering the evening. But as she zoomed in slightly on Liam's face, something flickered. For less than a second, Liam's familiar, easy grin was replaced by a face that was almost his, the features subtly distorted, the eyes vacant and staring slightly past the camera, the smile tight and unnatural. Then, instantly, it snapped back to the normal, smiling Liam. Chloe blinked, shaking her head. A compression artifact. A weird glitch in the app. She zoomed in again, panning across the photo. Everyone looked normal. Must have been tired eyes. A few days later, she was watching a short video clip posted by her colleague, Sarah. It showed Sarah laughing at her cat playing with a toy. As Sarah turned towards the camera, mid-laugh, her face flickered again, just for a frame or two. The joyous expression vanished, replaced by a look of stark, hollow-eyed fear. The sound didn't change, only the image, before instantly reverting to Sarah's cheerful laugh. This time, a chill traced its way down Chloe's spine. Twice was too much for a coincidence. It wasn't just a glitch, it was specific, targeting faces, replacing expressions with something unsettlingly wrong. She started paying closer attention, scrolling through her Moments feed with a new, uneasy focus. She began noticing it more often. A cousin's cheerful profile picture momentarily flashed with an expression of vacant sadness. An old university friend's wedding photo showed the groom, for an instant, looking not at his bride, but directly at the camera, at Chloe, with cold, empty eyes. These were people she knew well. The flickers weren't random distortions, they were specific, alternate versions, like reflections in a warped mirror. They were always fleeting, too fast to screenshot, existing only in that momentary transition as the image loaded or focus shifted. Chloe tried searching online, social media app face glitch, profile pictures changing momentarily, moments app uncanny faces. She found scattered forum posts, easily dismissed as hoaxes or technical errors, describing similar phenomena, but no concrete explanation, no official acknowledgement from the app developers. She cautiously mentioned it to Liam. "Hey, did you notice anything weird with that party photo you posted? Like, faces glitching for a second?" Liam laughed. "Glitching? Nah. Probably just your phone, Chloe. Mine looks fine. Maybe update the app." His dismissal, though friendly, made her feel isolated. Was she the only one seeing this? Was something wrong with her perception, her device? The flickers became more frequent, bolder. Sometimes, the faces weren't just distorted versions of her friends, they were complete strangers, their features momentarily superimposed over familiar ones. These stranger faces often had an old-fashioned quality, like figures from faded photographs, their expressions unnervingly blank or subtly menacing. One evening, scrolling through photos tagged from a busy street festival she hadn't attended, she zoomed in on the crowd. Faces flickered everywhere, dozens of them, replacing the cheerful attendees with vacant stares, hollow eyes, and grim expressions, like ghosts trapped in the digital ether, before snapping back to normal. It was horrifying, like catching glimpses of a hidden, decayed reality beneath the glossy surface of online life. The worst incident happened during a live video call with her parents. They lived overseas, and video calls were precious. As her mother was talking, laughing about a gardening mishap, her face flickered. For a long, terrifying second, it wasn't her mother's face on the screen, but that of an elderly woman Chloe had never seen before, her skin like pale parchment, her eyes dark voids, her mouth open in a silent O of despair. Then, just as suddenly, it was her smiling mother again, oblivious. Chloe ended the call abruptly, making an excuse, her hands shaking. This wasn't just happening in static photos or pre-recorded videos anymore. It was happening live. It felt invasive, predatory. She started limiting her time on moments, but the damage was done. The uncanny feeling bled into her offline life. She'd catch glimpses of strangers on the street whose faces seemed momentarily wrong. She'd see her own reflection in a shop window and, for a split second, think her expression looked vacant, unfamiliar. Was the app affecting her perception of reality, or was the phenomenon itself spreading? She became convinced the app was somehow feeding. Not on data, but on connection, on the faces, twisting them, leaving these disturbing digital echoes. She decided she had to cut it off entirely. With trembling fingers, Chloe navigated to her phone's settings and deleted the Moments app. She confirmed the deletion, watching the familiar blue icon vanish. A wave of relief, so potent it made her dizzy, washed over her. She felt free. She spent the rest of the evening deliberately offline, reading a physical book, trying to ground herself in tangible reality. The silence in her apartment felt clean, calm. Later, heading to bed, she walked past the hallway mirror near her bedroom door. She glanced at her reflection automatically. And froze. Staring back at her wasn't her own face. It was one of the flicker faces, a composite of features she almost recognized but couldn't place, the eyes too wide, the mouth set in a faint, unsettling smile that didn't reach the vacant eyes. It wasn't a fleeting glitch. It held steady, watching her from the mirror's surface. Her own familiar features were simply gone, replaced. Chloe couldn't breathe, couldn't scream. Her reflection, or the thing wearing her reflection, slowly raised a hand, mirroring her own terrified paralysis. It tilted its head, the unnatural smile widening slightly. She stumbled backwards, away from the mirror, heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. She squeezed her eyes shut, then forced them open again, whipping her head back towards the mirror. Her own face stared back, pale and wide-eyed with terror. The flicker face was gone. But was it truly gone? Or had it just snapped back, like the faces in the feed? She backed away into her bedroom, slamming the door shut, leaning against it, gasping for breath. The relief she'd felt earlier was gone, replaced by a deeper, colder horror. Deleting the app hadn't stopped it. It wasn't in the app. The app had just been the window, the place where the faces had learned to peek through. Now, the window was closed, but they were still looking. They knew her face. They could wear her face. She sat huddled on her bed in the dark, terrified to look at any reflective surface, terrified of the face that might look back. The silence of the apartment no longer felt peaceful. It felt like the stillness of being watched, of something waiting patiently just beyond the surface of reality, ready to flicker into view when she least expected it, perhaps eventually forgetting to flicker back. The feed was gone, but the faces remained.